Hello, everyone. I'd first like to thank ArtSwitch for providing this much needed platform to promote discussion about sustainable practices in the art sector. And a special thanks to Johanna, Charlotte, and Maud for all of your support and assistance. My name is Kim Kraczon. As Johanna mentioned, I've been working as the resident conservator in Studio Olafur Eliasson since 2013. I'm currently the director of waste and materials at Key Culture, a founding member of the Berlin branch of Gallery Climate Coalition, and a co-lead in Gallery Climate Coalition's packaging subcommittee. Today, I'm discussing the unique challenge of sustainable packing systems within an artist's studio. So here's a brief outline of my presentation. I'm starting with an introduction to Studio Olafur Eliasson, and then talking about our general sustainable initiatives from the past few years. Then I'm discussing pros and cons of various approaches to sustainable packing methods for artworks, along with special considerations we have to take into account when shipping artworks directly from an artist's studio. I'm ending the presentation with a case study of the packing evolution of Olafur's glass sphere artworks to illustrate how we are implementing sustainable packing methods, and then quickly touching upon what is on the horizon for sustainable packing. So for those of you who don't know who Olafur is or are not familiar with his work, he is a Danish-Icelandic artist known for his immersive installations, most notably the Weather Project at Tate Modern in 2003. The Weather Project was a site-specific installation in Tate's massive turbine hall, utilizing mist, an illuminated half circle, and a mirrored ceiling to construct an experiential artificial atmosphere. He is also known for addressing the issue of climate change with works such as Ice Watch from 2014, which is a public display of 12 large pieces of ice sheet from Greenland arranged in a clock-like formation and left to gradually melt, bringing attention to climate change through the simulation of melting ice caps. In addition to large-scale installations, smaller artworks are sold through galleries to institutions and private collectors. Studio Olafur Eliasson is the name of Olafur's production studio. It's located in Berlin, Germany, and consists of around 80 employees, and also includes Studio Other Spaces, which centers around interdisciplinary and experimental building projects, and Little Sun, which is a nonprofit organization that donates solar lights to off-grid communities worldwide. The artworks are envisioned, planned, fabricated, and then packed and created in-house by studio employees. The studio also undertakes the preparation and installation of several large solo exhibitions per year. And here I have a short clip to share with you guys from the installation of the exhibition in real life at Guggenheim Museum Bilbao from last year. This is just to give you an idea of the scale of these solo exhibitions. Okay. So about 2.5 years ago, we conducted a sustainability audit of sorts to minimize our carbon footprint in the studio. We took a closer look at not only our exhibition and production practices, but also our daily operations. Some of the immediate changes we made were shipping artworks with sea freight or by train instead of with air freight. For example, we shipped all of the artworks for the exhibition, Sometimes a River is the Bridge, last year at the Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo, first by train and then by sea freight. This map traces the route of the art shipment from Berlin to Tokyo, which took about 6 weeks. The studio sustainability initiatives additionally included reducing air travel by studio personnel and using digital modes of communication for on-site meetings and installations, which have normalized during the pandemic anyhow. We also cut out single-use plastics in our daily operations and encouraged our external partners and fabricators to make sustainable choices in their own production and transport practices. For the 2020 solo exhibition at Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo, the studio conducted a sustainability research lab, which showcased emerging materials made from industrial waste, as well as from various bio-based and recycled materials. One of my favorite projects belonging to the sustainability lab is the repurposing of food waste from the studio's kitchen as organic pigments for artworks. Just a little background on the studio kitchen. Our kitchen prepares studio employees predominantly vegan lunches sourced from an organic farm outside of Berlin. And I also have a clip here showing you guys the process of making the food waste pigments. So for my fellow conservators joining us today, I definitely share your anxieties when seeing that video. Okay, so as we continued on our mission to reduce our carbon footprint and synthetic waste generated by art production and shipping, I turned my attention to the packing materials and methods we were using to create artworks in the studio. Anyone involved with art fairs and museum exhibition knows how much waste is generated from synthetic packing materials. This is what spurred my interest in finding the best sustainable practices for creating artworks. We've always used traditional fossil fuel derived synthetic packing materials in the studio, such as polyethylene foams, Tyvek, and bubble wrap. I'm sure everyone is familiar with these common packing materials. We use them precisely because they're tried and tested. We know that they're inert, durable, and won't readily degrade in the crates, which makes them ideal for art transport and storage. But these same material properties are obviously not desirable at their end of life scenario. As we all know by now, synthetic materials can take up to hundreds of years to biodegrade in landfills, depending on the type of plastic. As many of you are also probably aware, plastic recycling isn't as commonplace as we've been led to believe. I'm sure some of you have come across that stat that only 8 to 9% of plastics ever manufactured have been recycled. The recycling myth can also be applied to the synthetic materials that we use as practitioners of cultural heritage. In the Waste and Materials Keybook, which I hope you all had a chance to download, it's free on the Key Culture website. We impress that these synthetic materials, Tyvek polyethylene foam, bubble wrap, plastic wraps, although theoretically recyclable, aren't typically curbside recyclable and usually end up in the landfill or incinerated. There's also a handy plastics resin table in the Waste and Materials Keybook outlining the different types of plastics we encounter in collections, care, and art transport, along with information on their recyclability or lack thereof. So the question remains, what are the current sustainable alternatives for packing materials? It's actually a complicated question because of concerns over material compatibility, meaning between the packing materials and the artworks, as well as the packing standards for artworks. When tasked with finding sustainable alternatives for our packing systems, my first inclination was simply switching out our traditional synthetic packing materials for one of the many materials available on the market made from natural renewable resources that are either biodegradable, compostable, or curbside recyclable. Some examples of these materials are paper-based products such as corrugated cardboard, shredded paper, filled paper cushions, and molded pulp. I was also looking into cork and natural felt. And then of course, we have bio-based foams made from cornstarch and other vegetable starches, PLA, which stands for polylactic acid, and mycelium, which is produced from the tubular filament of fungi. I also want to take a moment here to define the terms biodegradable and compostable. Biodegradable means decomposition by a biological process into water, carbon dioxide, and biomass without human intervention. There's no implicit time frame for the decomposition rate of biodegradable materials. Compostable means the biodegradation of substance through a human intervention, which is to say home compost, industrial compost facilities, which require controlled environments and high temperatures. It's crucial to understand these terms when researching these materials. Some products claim to be compostable, but require industrial composting, which isn't available everywhere. These alternatives to synthetic plastics have many desirable properties as sustainable materials. They're made from renewable resources or recycled materials instead of fossil fuels. They have a lower carbon footprint or a negative carbon footprint, as is the case with mycelium. And they're non-toxic and can be disposed of with less detriment to the environment. So I have an image here of cornstarch foam. We come across it typically in the form of packing peanuts, and it's dissolvable in water. Mycelium is 100% natural and will biodegrade in water or soil within 90 days, which sounds great, right? So these materials initially seem like a good solution, but they also have properties that render them inappropriate for use with artworks and cultural artifacts. They have shorter lifespan than traditional synthetics and can degrade over time, which alters their physical properties as packing materials. Some are hygroscopic, which means they attract moisture from the air and can expose artworks to moisture, which we want to avoid. When some of these materials are exposed to moisture, they are potentially susceptible to mold and fungal growth. And some of the paper-based materials also become acidic over time, which means they can't be used in combination with all materials. I do want to stress at this time that I believe these natural packing materials can find an application in short-term transport with certain types of artworks and cultural artifacts, especially when we are certain that someone is on the receiving end to remove the artworks from the crates within a reasonable time frame. But I arrived at the conclusion that we can't implement the use of these materials for our studio artworks because of the following considerations. Once an artwork is sold to a private collector, there's a possibility that the artwork isn't immediately installed and remains in the transport crate for an extended period of time. And the crate and packing systems are customized for the artwork and are intended for reuse. The crate is purchased along with the artwork and belongs to that particular artwork. On the first page of the installation guide for every artwork leaving the studio, we explicitly encourage the reuse of the crate and packing materials. So until we test these bioplastics and bio-based materials for their suitability in long-term shipping and storage, or until archival quality biodegradable and compostable packing materials are available, or stuck using traditional archival synthetic materials that won't degrade over time and potentially damage artworks in their crates. So when thinking about using archival synthetic materials, it's useful to reference the 5 R's in the waste hierarchy. This is also a page from the key book. At the top of the hierarchy is refusing, but as I just outlined, this isn't an option because there aren't suitable alternatives for long-term storage at this time. But we can focus on the next 2 R's in the hierarchy, reducing and reusing. With these considerations and the waste hierarchy in mind, we decided to use archival synthetic materials, but rethink crate design to reduce the amount needed for the safe transport of artworks. In addition to reducing the amount of these materials, we also try to purchase foams, plastic films, and bubble wrap with recycled content or plastics that are partially bio-based, for example, polyethylene foam manufactured with green solvents. We also order from the closest supplier to Berlin to minimize carbon emissions from shipping. So now I'm going to walk you all through the evolution of packing methods for our glass sphere works in the studio. Glass sphere works is the term we use in the studio to describe artworks installed on a wall comprising various size glass spheres. The spheres range in size from a diameter of 30 millimeters to a diameter of 400 millimeters. The glass spheres are coated in a variety of materials. They're partially metallized with silver, aluminum, or gold, and can be coated with either acrylic or black epoxy. The number of spheres involved in these artworks can range from as few as 12 to over 1,000, as is the case with this artwork that has 1,134 glass spheres. So this is an example of how we previously packed glass spheres. Each sphere is individually wrapped in Tyvek and then packed on top of a polystyrene base with holes cut out to cradle each individual sphere in place. The spheres are then additionally surrounded by strips of polyurethane foam, topped with yet another layer of polyurethane foam. An empty space in the crate was filled with even more polyurethane foam. It's actually quite painful to look at. Because polyurethane foam isn't archival and can damage the material components of the spheres, on top of not being the most environmentally friendly material, redesigning the glass sphere crates took on urgency, and we started thinking about new packing methods. So the concept for redesigning the glass sphere crates centered around utilizing all the space in the crates, implementing packing materials that are archival and durable for reuse, but also reducing the amount of these materials. And of course, our #1 concern is to ensure that the glass spheres arrive safely at their destination and can remain in their crates long-term if necessary. So I chose to replace the polyurethane foam with polyethylene foam. The spheres are sandwiched in between 2 layers of polyethylene foam with holes corresponding to the size of spheres to prevent movement during transport. Small blocks of polyethylene foam on the top layer apply pressure to the spheres when the crate lid is closed. Instead of individually wrapping each sphere, the idea was to use one singular sheet of Tyvek that protects the coated surface of the glass sphere from abrasion during transport. This new method significantly reduced the quantity of Tyvek and foam in the crate. We conducted a test run with a mock-up crate, which you can see here. We dropped the crate, tipped it over, and sent it on a joyride through the streets of Berlin. The glass spheres did not budge, and we felt confident applying the new packing methods to artworks. A brilliant colleague of mine who collaborated with me on this packing system also devised a formula for determining the arrangement and thickness of foam in the crates, which you can see here on the right. So these are the first iterations of the new packing system. As you can see on the left, an issue arose when spheres of differing sizes were packed in the same crate and longer blocks of polyethylene foam were needed to provide the necessary pressure on the spheres. So more material was used and it kind of defeated the purpose. We continued with the aim to minimize the amount of foam in the crates. Another brilliant colleague of mine improved on this packing system by adjusting the heights of different sized spheres from underneath. In this method, all of the spheres, regardless of their size, sit at the same level and can be covered in a single sheet of foam without the use of foam blocks. And this is our most recent iteration. For this particular crate, we used cardboard instead of foam blocks to apply pressure to the spheres. I know I previously stated that cardboard wasn't archival and therefore not appropriate for our packing systems, but we knew this artwork would not stay in the crate long term, so I allowed the cardboard. And if the artwork does stay in the crate, the cardboard can also be removed. So the most current approach is actually a combination of the two sustainable approaches, which are minimizing the use of synthetic materials and allowing some non-archival natural materials in the crate when we know an artwork will be immediately uncrated. So what's next in the pursuit of sustainable packing methods? Well, we're going to continue redesigning crates and rethinking packing systems in Studio Olafur Eliasson in accordance with the waste hierarchy. I'm always keeping an eye on emerging bioplastics and bio-based materials. It seems like there's new ones popping up on the market every few weeks. Obviously, we need to audit test these materials for their suitability as packing materials in art transport and storage. And then creating guidelines for the suitability of these materials for short-term transport versus long-term transport and storage. As I mentioned earlier, I do think natural and bio-based packing materials can definitely find an application in art transport under certain circumstances. I'm currently working with the Gallery Climate Coalition's packaging subcommittee, and with the assistance from conservation labs, we're defining the parameters for their use. The Gallery Climate Coalition is providing a comprehensive packing guide in the coming months, so stay tuned to their website. I'm also updating the Waste and Materials Keybook with new alternative materials this year, so look out for that as well. So thank you all so much for listening, and I guess now we open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Kim. What a wonderful presentation. I think I'd love to learn more about the testing you mentioned and the guidelines. What do you think is the best way to create a system to test all these new materials, especially with all the new materials coming on the market, and to create a system that is easily applicable for anyone, anywhere?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we need to define is short-term versus long-term. And this is discussions. I'm in this packaging group. We're having meetings as we speak. So nothing's really solidified yet, but the idea is to define short-term versus long-term, which also depends on what type of crates are being used. If a crate is a climate-controlled crate, is there a gasket? Is it sealed? Is it coated? Is it waterproof? I mean, there's so many variables. But the idea is to essentially create a guide for each one of those variables. And then applying the various materials that can be used. For example, if you're shipping a painting overnight somewhere, I would personally think that using some of these natural bio-based materials is totally acceptable. However, if an artwork stays in the crate or is shipped long-term, which we're going to see now that sea freight is more common in shipping, then we have to think about the internal climate of the crate and how that affects the materials involved.
I think a few questions came right on those materials too, on the testing. One was, how can we as practitioners help with these researches? Is it just a question of waiting for the guidelines, or is there a way that others can help with this?
I mean, we are planning on testing these materials out with the galleries involved with Gallery Climate Coalition. And I mean, anyone's welcome to reach out to me. We're working on finding samples and again, first testing these materials and then putting them into action with dummy crates and coming up with some sort of criteria to check off of how appropriate they are for different types of art crating.
And have you been evaluating the biomaterials for susceptibility to pest infestations? Came in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't work for a research institute or conservation labs. I have not done this personally. I know that there have been, I have kind of heard through the grapevine that some of these materials are susceptible to pest infestation. But I'm sure a quick search on the internet could potentially bring that information up. But personally, no, I've not tested these myself.
Do you have any recommendations for an artist studio or an institution that wants to start to change the materials they're using in the packaging? What is your best advice on that way, where to start? And especially also if financial aspects play in that there might not be that many funds to change materials, or research or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think it depends on whether or not, as I mentioned in my presentation, if the crates are, belong to the artworks, or if it's just to transport the artworks over a few days. There are paper products that are very inexpensive that can be used for short-term shipping. I know in Germany, we have these filled paper cushions that we use often in the studio to pack components of artworks, like electrical components that aren't potentially sensitive to acid. Yeah, so I don't think that there has to be a large investment of money in these materials. There's also machines that turn cardboard into shredded packing material, which then is reusing material you already have.
Thank you. From Roxy in the chat, do you work with particular manufacturers for the mycelium and cornstarch?
I mean, we're not using those materials. So, but I know in the States, I think it's called green cell foam is a cornstarch foam. And then in the UK, it's BioViron is producing cornstarch foam. And for the mycelium foams, it's, I forget the name of the company. There's a I forget the names of the companies, I'm sorry. A lot of companies. Think of it, yeah, I forget the names.
I think another question coming up is where does the change come from? Annika touches upon it slightly with the question if art buyers should be the one helping to bear the cost for this transition into sustainable materials. Do you have thoughts on that, on where best to implement this change from, and where does the power lie to change it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had discussions as well of giving collectors the option of having, if they, because the thing is, oftentimes, for example, the artwork that I showed with 1,134 spheres, that work has 13 crates. And storing these crates, as you can imagine, is very costly, and people don't have the storage for them. And typically these crates are essentially trashed. And then, so in that line of thought, if we know beforehand that a crate's going to be discarded immediately after and not reused, then you could use more of like the linear, biodegradable, compostable materials, make sure there's no adhesives in there that are synthetic, and everything can essentially go back into the biological cycle. And if a client or a collector then requests a crate that they want to reuse, then we could potentially also make crates that are easily disassemblable. You can disassemble them and store them with greater ease. But these are, again, ideas that have not been implemented yet.
It brings me back to one of the presentations we had at our last conference on Joel and Caitlin's on the fear also of changing, actually, of making the jump to changing materials or climate systems we're working with. Do you think there's a way that we could, I mean, you're working on these guidelines, as you say, that we can assure institutions, and probably also larger institutions than an artist studio where the power lies more in one person's hand to make a choice, to change, and that these materials are really as safe as the guidelines might say? Or yeah, how can we reassure people to change, let's say it that way?
Yeah, I think, we're in the very early stages of these. I mean, these materials are also fairly new, and we are in the early stages of trying to figure out whether or not they are acceptable. And I think it just takes a series of again, having them vetted by conservators. I'm in contact with some art transport companies that are willing to jump on board, and it's basically just trial and error and see what comes out of it. And the materials that we do deem as acceptable, and sort of past these physical standards that we have for packing materials, maybe in a few years, and it'll be well, that's big, yeah. maybe like a year, then we can bring them into the mainstream, and then everyone, I guess, maybe will hopefully use them on their own.
I hope so. A question from Bert-Jan. What is the development in making packaging out of fast-growing plants like bamboo or hennep? Do you have any insights on that?
Well, I mean, again, there's issues then with these materials. This, as I said in the presentation, I think it's great. I mean, any fast-growing plant uses any material, like far better than fossil fuels or slow-growing organic material.